Well, not a particular fan of Marx. I wanted to take just a short video and drill into um, some of his economic principles. I found it really hilarious that searching on Marx on YouTube, um, one of these really thoughtful channels that was quite popular that describes many philosophers says it's a pity that Marx's economic theories are not more considered today. And that just made me lose my lunch. Now, closure, I've lived in the peak of, I was raised in a communist country, um, bloc. I've firsthand experience of the wonders of socialism and its application. So I have no love lost for Marx. Um, More importantly, if you actually look into his life, you'll realize that although there's a big contrast there, and it's blatantly obvious that he's in effect a manipulator, right? Because if you look at his writings, he seems to be going on and on about the class differences, the oppression of the proletariat, and it just seems like if you wanted to describe him, he should be, the working man's champion. But when you look at actually the way he lived his life, he didn't associate with the working man. He had allergy to the working man. He had no love of the working man. And in fact, the few interactions he had when he was in various socialist organizations, and there were labor leaders, people with dirt under their fingernails having actual ideas, he would discount them as being, invalid because they don't come forth from a academic theory. Therefore, they don't have the value and they're not sustainable. So that's the type of just narcissistic detachment that you see promulgated down and down the ages in almost all of the theories that he's served to influence. So there's this perfidy there. There's this cheap sort of manipulation and this blatant disdain, because it's almost as if he thinks that the proletariat is too dumb to notice, but he needs to be taken care of because he's being oppressed. And of course, his pitch is also so simplistic that I find it mind-boggling that it had been so well taken by so many. But perhaps this is why so many took on his interpretations and then reinterpreted themselves, because for the time, perhaps it was sufficient. I don't know. But there's been quite a bit of modification, many versions of Marxism since. And I wanted to do a few videos and just kind of chase down, here's some four bad ideas, and here's their chain of custody. Where do they come from? Where did Marx get them? How did they influence? This one's going to be focused on his economic view. Now, again, economy. The man never studied economics. He went to school for law, was miserable at it, then kind of changed to just philosophy and then embraced Hegel. Couldn't quite graduate from the University of Berlin, moved to the University of Bonn, but that was also a good university. Couldn't cut it there. Went to Jena. Jena was kind of like Chico, got a degree there. And he basically wrote for the rest of his life. His entire life he spent in debt. For a man with deep economic insights, that should be a red flag. Never visited a factory. In fact, his good friend Engels, who was somewhat wealthy, had a factory, and he would have to go there periodically to deal with specific issues. Every invitation he had for Marx to come along, Marx declined. His view of the economic situation of the time was primarily through the periodicals, whatever, through hearsay. And his view of economics was whatever he could muster out in life. He loved to hang out in libraries or hang out with his intellectual buddies. All through this, you'll see that on the economic side, he does this yellow journalism pitch around exploitation. And let's get to that one. His view. Now, right off the bat, it should be a red flag that his view of economics seems to be simplified down to the act of industrial production, the production of a product by a factory. And his view is, look, what's a product's value? What you sell it for, the value that you collect. But the worker, well, he puts in the commanded labor. The commanded labor would be the task labor, whatever you're hired for, whatever you're being paid hourly for. And we'll say a chair. And then there's also embodied labor. I love the use of embodied labor as if, it's also the workers, but that would be the tools, the resources, the materials that go in, the factory, the everything else, all of that other stuff that he didn't bother to figure out. There's there's an effect today that we call the Dunning Kruger effect, which is basically what I like to think of as the amplified stupidity effect. When you don't know something, your first impression of that task would be that it's very simple or almost trivial. And it is because you know nothing about it. And once you dig into it, you realize, wow, there's a lot more to this, and it's a lot more complex than I thought. And that's sort of the sign of wisdom. Marx is a walking Dunning-Kruger effect. So the idea is you take this embodied labor, the materials and the means to produce them, the commanded labor, subtract that from the sales price, and what's left is the surplus value. That's, again, masterful positioning of that term. Surplus, extraneous, not necessary. So the dirty capitalist takes the surplus and shoves it in his pocket, while the poor laborer goes home to his starving wife and children. There's no concept here of risk, of what happens if, for example, the sales price goes a bit lower than the combined cost of EL and CL. Now, that's not a discussion. And again, it's that view of Marx that wants to focus in on here, where the problem is that he wants to showcase and ignore everything else. And of course, he positions the surplus value as exploitation, and that's really the crux of most of his writing. You take a little bit of Hegel's master-slave relationship, and you sprinkle in the idea that if you have things, it's because you oppress someone, because you were a master, and therefore, we can tell you're a master because you have stuff. And whoever doesn't have stuff, well, they're a slave. And guess what? If you have stuff, probably beat up somebody to get it, and therefore you're a bad person. If you don't have stuff, by definition, you're a good person. That is just as simplistic as it gets. And of course, he wrote the Communist Manifesto. He didn't start communism. He didn't come up with communism. Communism was going on its own. There were some rebellions in 48, and he thought he'd get on the bandwagon, so he wrote this little pamphlet. Mind you, this was in 48, long before he ever started on Das Kapital. Das Kapital, his first one was published in 67, and the other two volumes were published after his death by Engels. Also, a question mark for me there is that Engels was quite a bit critical of the Das Kapital to Marx, because he felt it had some gaps. And since it didn't come out till after his death, I really wonder if Engels kind of took a little, brush to the work, because it was not as good as perhaps it could be. And maybe what we have today is what these amazing economic ideas of Marx's are. Perhaps maybe Engels is, but who knows? One of the thoughts that sort of evolves out of the Communist Manifesto is this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, don't think democracy, because that would be wrong. It is basically, and Michael Bakunin was one of the revolutionaries, philosophers of Russia, sort of contemporary of Marx, eventually met him, and his term was this concept of, well, he's pushing in this new class, and the new class is intellectuals ruling, representing the proletariat. So again, the pros are too dumb to know what they need. We the intelligent, know. And it's that sort of detached narcissism that you will see cascading down the ages. Bakunin's take of Marx was very immediate. Now, he saw Marx as valuable. I mean, he definitely took on some of his works because he saw that from the perspective of manipulative sort of yellow journalism, they were very effective. Not what he says. He says he wasn't as... Bakunin doesn't think of himself as evolved as Marx, obviously. Still an idealist. I think that's a lot of word salad to kind of say that, I wasn't ready to do the dirty deeds that were necessary. But Bakunin, on meeting Marx, he says, called me a sentimental idealist, and he was right. I called him a vain man, perfidious and crafty. I also was right. Just let that sink in. And now this is a revolutionary with the same aims as Marx, supposedly. They're in the same camp. But he looks at him and he's a vain, perfidious man. Crafty. So, okay. I've always found it funny that the hammer and the sickle were just so apt in terms of symbology, because the economic theory is as to be as blunt as a hammer. So almost any problem it sees, it treats as a nail. And of course, the ideology was that which, think of the symbolic representation of death and the sickle. They would, if you oppose them, they would come and take you into. So it was just sort of the 1-2 punch of communism and all of the other horrible shit. But let's let's go into the philosophy. Now remember, again, it's very easy to see why this caught fire, because this was the world of his day. You know, these were the conditions. So it is extremely understandable to see that a worker would feel that he would never be able to get out of the situation, that he's oppressed, that he's under the boot heel of the dirty capitalist. So he's servicing an audience that's quite receptive. Here's his rules. Communist Manifesto, top 10, what they were called planks. Abolition of private property, specifically land, the application of all rents of land to public purpose. Okay, I kind of see that. I mean, obviously you'd want to go after the landowners, but it's abolition. It's not restoration, nothing. The value is just simply transferred to the state. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Now, remember, this is also a time when income tax wasn't necessarily a common thing. We didn't get income tax in the States till much later. So I'm really wondering what, so my assumption is for incomes, it would be whatever derivative incomes are coming out of the rich, because it has to be progressive and graduated. So the more money you make, the more money you'll have to pay. But it fits a lot better in today's world. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez can very easily talk about this. But at the time where it came out, it wasn't necessarily the same world. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. That's an interesting. That's where you begin to see that he kind of missed that whole sort of human psychology motivation thing. One of the most motivating things about humans in general was, you might be in a shitty situation, but you know that if you work hard and you scrimp and you save, even if you don't make it out of the predicament you're in, out of the class you're in, your kids will. That's really been the motivating factor of sort of the settlers, the immigrants, all of the hardworking, progressive work. Now, when you die, we'll just take your stuff and distribute it amongst ours. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. Now, it might be that you haven't seen the word in a while, emigrants. Talk about immigration, If you're in the States, you've hardly ever heard about emigration, the E. That would be exiting the country. That would be leaving the country. Doesn't happen a lot in the States. Happens a lot everywhere else. Wonder why. Well, I guess he obviously saw that, hey, if I take over a state, some people might want to leave. So, okay, if they leave, I'll take their stuff. That's an interesting. Right? Hitler had that view. Stalin had that view. Guess where they got it? And the rebels. The rebels really would be people that don't agree with you. They disagree with you to such a degree where they might actually want to oppose your views, and you can't have that, so you'll also confiscate their property. Mind you, they're not immigrants. They're staying there, but you'll just take their stuff. So that's fundamentally what happened. We took their stuff and, they just got killed. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. Now, this is where you start seeing the first inkling of the globalist, because we've now had the benefit of a few hundred years, and you go, wow, that's not such a great little thing for helping the little guy. That's more of a thing for helping big financial institutions. So either this was some perfidious thing that he kind of stuck in there, or maybe he was just that ignorant that this was not a great idea. Centralization of the means of communication and transportation. Now, if you're trying to trap somebody in a country, you definitely don't want him to have access to talking to anybody else or transporting themselves the hell out of there. So, of course, you'd have to take. So I hope you're getting the idea that these first 10 planks seem an awful lot like creating a prison state, not so much as a utopia of the prole. The extension of factories and instruments of productions owned by the state, the bringing into civilization, cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. This is my favorite because it begins to show where he no longer has expertise. It's kind of like when somebody's writing about Noah's Ark, and there was this animal, and others, right? I no longer have details, so I'm not going to put any in. So what are you going to do to the factories? We're going to extend factories. The means of production. How? I don't know. What are you going to do to the land? We're going to improve the soil generally. So there's really not the whole point is like, well, there'll be a centralized plan, and that's it. There really isn't any meat on those bones. Equal obligation of all to work, well, of course. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. I love how he also throws in agriculture periodically, because that was sort of the Achilles heel of the Russian Revolution. because he went on and on and on about the proles. They didn't really have a handbook for what to do about the farmers, and they weren't kind in what they did, and caused the starvation of many people. Put about 20 million Ukrainians at risk of death, 6 million of which actually died, but eventually got help from the Western world. So it wasn't a complete starvation of the population. It was a partial one. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of population over. Now this one is straight out of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan would take whatever skilled labor from wherever he conquered and shipped it back. He would just keep moving this. This was a big tactic favored by empire builders everywhere. Stalin loved to do it. This is, why there's so many native-born Russians in Ukraine and everywhere else. He kept trying to mix populations, so the idea of national ethno identity would be gone. Perhaps a good idea, perhaps not. But having lived in a country that applied this, it wasn't uncommon for a person walking down the street, especially if it was during work hours, to get stopped by the police officer. Your papers, please. Okay, do you work? Where do you work? If you didn't have an answer to that question, you would get arrested. And then you would be working. You would be shipped off to wherever the next labor crisis was. Didn't have to be in your town, didn't have to be remotely close to your town. It could be across the country, and you had no say in it. Now just imagine how secure you would feel in a country like that. This happened. It happened across the Eastern Bloc, period. Last but not least, free education for all children in government schools. Okay. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Kind of a strange one to stick with education, but okay. Combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc., etc. Wait a minute. Okay, I understand abolishing child labor. Heinous practice. Let's get rid of it. But let's teach children in government schools. But let's it's not higher ed. It's a combination of industrial education, right? It's basically let's teach people how to have a trade, because we're going to need lots of proletariats to crank out the trade. So I hope you're getting a picture of there's no change for the working man. He just changes masters. But it's a centralized master, and it's an intelligent master, one that really knows what's good for you. And for some reason, people just ate this crap up. Now, these are the descriptions of other Marxist luminaries when commenting upon the 4 key ideas in Marxism. This would be, the first one is materialism, and I've kind of explained that, which is the simplest way I can put it, is if you have stuff, you are a bad person. The idea was that materialist and the chase for the material really influenced the way we think about who's deserving and who should lead and who gets paid what, and because of the stuff they make. But it should really be idealistic. It doesn't really offer you the idealism of what. It doesn't give you any sort of concrete examples as to here's how a superior person, and here's why this person should. It's all left up to the intellectual to decide, him. Exploitation we talked about. This was the whole surplus being exploitative. And what I love is you can see the post-60s edition here. Marxists have since developed his theory to explore how capitalism also exploits the planet and its natural resources. According to Marx, capitalists exploit laborers by paying them less than they're worth. Say how much they're worth. Doesn't say how much less. Should he pay them more? Should he pay them everything? The excess labor of the laborer is what becomes the capitalist profits. The surplus labor is exploited by the capitalists who force blah, blah, blah. You get it. If you listen to, for example, Richard Wolff, you'll hear this played back over and over and over. And at no point does it go any deeper than that. It may have different descriptions of the embodied labor or whatever, but at no point is there, so what is the right split? Or how much should I put in value? In any case. Alienation. This one's a really tough one because the best I could explain it is you have to do your job while you're at work. That's bad. Because you see, from having to work, it really captures how you would otherwise naturally live. And now you have to be there and do whatever the job says. So if you're making a mirror, it doesn't really embody you. You're not expressing yourself the way you would if you were free. It would make the mirror differently. But now you have to make it in this factory setting, and you have to make it per spec. Therefore, it dehumanizes you. Now, I can see all of the emotional tugs here where it's like, yeah, if I'm working, I'm just doing this brain numbing thing and it's just taking the humanity. I can see that. I just don't see how work under Marxism would be any different. And surprisingly, it isn't. It's just work sucks when you have to do it. That's alienation. And of course, his last one is the big prediction. Um, just just no foreshadowing here. His prediction never actually comes true. And that's been sort of the problem of Marxists everywhere. He believed that obviously you're looking at the Industrial Revolution, it's booming like a mother. It's about to pop off, right? So if you see a whole bunch of workers being needed, this key new thing that's happening in the world, you see this oppression, well, of course, they're eventually going to blow up and take over. Except it never happens. Now, there's lots of disgruntled events, right? There's lots of strikes. There's lots of, clashes. But it continues. Because eventually, the dirty little trick is one of these dirty little pros eventually gets himself enough embodied labor in his own pocket, and then he can become a dirty capitalist too. And this is the rate of progress. But again, embedded in Marx are a series of bad ideas that he even doesn't realize that he's harboring. And I'll go into those in other videos. But things like the Malthusian trap, the zero-sum game, he doesn't have any idea of this concept of created value. He sees a pie that needs to be sliced a different way. He doesn't see the fact that that pie was made by someone and other pies could be made. He simply sees the pie and he wants a bigger slice for him and his. And that's fundamentally what is just at the core rot of this idea. So I've got just a simple example to illustrate this, and then we'll close. So here's, depart with me on this thought experiment. You are a dirty capitalist. Yes, you are. And because you're a dirty capitalist, you've managed to put away some money. That's why you have a beautiful house, and your wife drives this beautiful Mercedes, and you're coming home from your dirty capitalist job. You're almost there, right? You're about to park right next to your wife's car. But this day is a little different because this guy shows up. Right there, right in front of your gate, and say, hey, buddy, can I park your car for $5? So I just pause a minute. Most people would be like, get the hell out of here. Let's just not assume that there's any sort of criminal threat or anything like that. Let's just say that he's genuinely trying to park your car. You would obviously not have any reason to pay this man because you're driving, you're behind the wheel of your car. It's another second of effort for you to pull in where you've pulled in every single day of your life. So this is really not an area of your life that you need any assistance with. So not only would you not value this at $5, you wouldn't even value it at 50 cents. So at this point, this man's offered labor is worth zero because there is no demand for this service right now. It's something you can obviously do. You have the time to do it because you're already coming home. It isn't that much incremental benefit to you. Okay? So keep that in mind. 2, you and your dirty capitalist buddies have this great idea. You know that there's this empty plot of forest, a little bit far out of town. And you've got this friend who's 1/8 Cherokee and kind of like Elizabeth Warren could claim the rights for an Indian gambling license. You get like 20, 30 of your dirty capitalists together and you put a business plan together. You get like some, $40, $50 million loan from the bank. You get the builders to build the most spanking hotel, great resort casino, big parking structure, got clubs there, invite comedy talent, invite music talent, and slot machines as far as the eye can see, and bang, you got a new Indian casino. Now, it took quite a bit to build it. Now it's open, right? You're kind of in hock, but hey, it's going to make a lot of money. Of course, what do you need? You need parking. So the same guy, right there, right as you come to drive after your 1 hour long drive from the city, you want to come gamble, you might come here for just a few hours. You might want to stay a few days, especially given the beautiful resort rooms and spa and all of that stuff. You might stay 1, 2, 4, 5 days. So not only would you pay $20 a day, you might pay 40, 60, 100. So all of a sudden, you're a little bit more elastic on your valuation of parking. And in fact, you don't see a problem paying $20 a day, parking right in, right? So something's changed. But let's look at it from the perspective of the guy who's sitting here parking your car. He came to you and he wanted a job, so you offered him $7 an hour, which happens to be the going rate for this region, right? Now let's look at it from his. Like, God damn it, I work 10 hours a day parking about 100 cars every day. That's $2,000 I make for this asshole, and he pays me $70. 10 hours at $7 an hour. $1,930 profit I make for this guy, the surplus value. He is exploiting me. You can see that, right? That's perfectly valid. $2,000, and he's only getting 70 out of that 2,000. I mean, that's just so unbalanced, isn't it? Completely unbalanced. I mean, $70 versus 2,000. You know, it's not 50-50. Okay. Now, when he was hired, there was a ad in the paper for $7, and lots of people came and wanted to get hired, and he got hired along with him. If nobody would have come, you probably would have put another ad in the paper, say $10 an hour. Nobody would have come then, $15 an hour, $20 an hour, whatever. Whatever the price was that makes people come is the market prevailing wage. It might not be a living wage. It might not be any kind of wage. Many people might have issues with it, but people showed up, right? You didn't force them. They came in voluntarily. They didn't have to. And I'm not making a commentary about the minimum wage. I'm simply making a commentary on the prevailing wage. Now, let's say that he's absolutely right. This is exploitation. Let's take away the building. Let's remove the building and fill it right back in with all of the trees. Leave the parking guy. How exploited is his work now? He's sitting there. He has no demand for that labor, right? Again, the value of that labor goes right down to zero. It has nothing to do with him. It has nothing to do with, he's no less capable. He's no less willing. He's no less trained, skilled, whatever you want to call it. He's got all of the same attributes he ever had. But what's gone behind him is the capitalist. The capitalist that created the demand for the work. It's the capitalist that created the opportunity and the environment for that to be in demand and to actually escalate the price, right? So while there is some mild, maybe, I would say minor justification that perhaps you might want to elevate his pay, I would say that really has to do with the prevailing market. And yes, if fundamentally you look at the world and you're actually you're obviously taking advantage of a whole bunch of people that have no other choice, otherwise they would starve, then yes, I would concede to you that you need to raise the price. But to simply apply it to exploitation and completely ignore everything that's in behind whatever job this is completely ignorant. So yeah, maybe it's exploitation, but the discussion isn't, let's now kill the casino owner, take it over, and we'll manage it better. Because unfortunately, we've seen how that works in almost every case. So again, this is the world that he wrote this book for. That world no longer exists anywhere. So it's probably not a good idea to adopt his economic view. Let's just kind of recap in terms of how successful this has been. No country that ever adopted the Marxist ideology has ever improved the situation. None. Many failed all the way to starvation and had to be, bailed out by surrounding non-Marxist places where food actually was still being grown. Every one of them have steadily moved towards totalitarianism. Some of them raced right to it, like the Soviet Union or the Nazis. And yes, Nazis were socialists. They were Marxist. Now, the problem is when you bring some criticism here, you'll tend to hear some of the same replies. And the most favorite, well, that was not real Marxism. That was not real communism. That was not real socialism. That's not really what I mean. And it's part of this bigger argument, right? This argument of you just don't understand what it is. It isn't that the criticism is valid. It's your comprehension as a critic is important. And I love, like, whenever you hear, like, Richard Wolff or almost every other acolyte of Marxism, I find it bizarre that you would interpret Marx this way. It isn't just you're dumb and you don't understand it. It's in fact bizarre that you would just completely go this way. But what follows is word salad. There's never what you don't get is this, and adjusting it down to the economic pragmatism or the math that here's why it works. No, no, no. It's just bizarre that you don't understand it. It's your lack of understanding that's causing your misalignment of this comprehension. And now, of course, when pressed for some examples, you'll hear some, and they're hilarious in their own way. If you want examples of success, they have some. They have some political ones, and they all lasted months before they collapsed. That would be the Paris Commune, Catalonia, and the Paris Student Revolt in '68. All of which were sort of socialist, commune things that got set up and immediately collapsed. Now, the latest one is the being able to point at a company in Spain called Mondragon. That's a co-op. There's nothing particularly Marxist about a co-op. And of course, the blatant thing that they are choosing not to focus on is that it's operating inside of a communist society, of a capitalist society. They are a company that buys and sells stuff in the capitalist market. What's different is that this was in a village somewhere that was fairly remote, wasn't seeing much investment, so a Catholic priest decided to get everybody in town together and found a company. And they've worked. They've been able to be successful and provide for their village. A Catholic priest. Not a lot of Catholic priests being, seeing a lot of traction in communist countries. They tend to get shooed away. So, yeah, if you have the basis of sort of Christian values and everybody wants to be charitable to one another, yeah, that might work. And it does work in this one case. There are many other co-ops, not many of which last. Because usually the way you engage in a co-op is a company that exists hits some critical aspect of it and it's about to go belly up. And then through some fortune and some, proper planning, the employees last minute are able to get together and buy out the company. And it's remaining, like tooling and all that stuff, and then basically reopen the company. And sometimes they can make a success of it because maybe they don't have the same obligations, they don't have the same constraints as the profit margin, etc. It sometimes works, but it doesn't normally. In fact, there's very few examples. There's another example here in the States called SAIC, which is basically a very large government contractor, defense contractor. It's an employee-owned company. It has a stock system, and it's basically the stock is sold to employees. It isn't publicly traded. It isn't a traditional company. But it is no different in function than every other company. It happens to be employee-owned, as is Mondragon. So that's not particularly Marxist. It isn't some sort of central planning state that's coming down to tell you how to do your job because you're the proletariat and you should listen to the intellectuals. So again, it's like Marx is another one of these three-card Monty type of pitches. So my primary issue with just Marx. I mean, everything else you can be really, really outraged about, everything that comes down from Marx. But with Marx, I don't like him because he is deceitful. And he's trying to pull something on a class of people that already have problems. And he's done it, and has done it to the detriment of. And the other, if this doesn't convince you, I hope this will. Given the world we live in, tell me where the exploitation is here. Because there is no labor being exploited here. Robots mean bye-bye Marx. Now, the robots came because of capitalist invention, right? Innovation, all of that stuff. And they're coming no matter what. So, does Marxism really have a place in this world? I would submit to you that it doesn't. And with that, talk to you soon.